Hey everyone, Tactics here, bringing you guys DPS rankings for raids and Mythic Plus in Shadowlands Season 1. This video takes into account all of the adjustments from the last week of beta, up to and including the Mythic Castle Nathria tuning pass that happened on December 15th. As with all of my rankings videos, I am going to add a brief disclaimer. These rankings are based on how specs are looking in both higher Mythic Plus keys and Mythic rating, and becomes less relevant for lower level content. If you're someone who only wants to complete ahead of the curve or just get your Keystone Master achievement, every single DPS spec on this list is more than capable of doing that, so I'd recommend you play the spec that you enjoy the most. With that said, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like and subscribe for more Warcraft content, and let's start by looking at our C tier DPS in Castle Nathria rating. In this bottom tier, we have a few specs that check some unfortunate boxes, with all three being melee, having poor to mediocre utility, low to below average overall damage, and having access to a better DPS spec. To begin, we have Fury Warriors, who did recently see a flat 5% buff, however this hasn't changed much, leaving them as one of the lowest damage specs in the game. When it comes to utility, it's a bit mediocre with Rallying Cry and Battle Shout, however this can also be brought by Arms, which is currently faring a bit better, as well as Prot if you have one. Joining them in the C tier we have Assassination Rogues, another spec that recently received a 5% buff, which similarly didn't help much. On top of this, Rogues have access to two other better specs right now in Subtlety and Outlaw, making Assassination quite undesirable. To finish up our bottom tier raid specs, we have Survival Hunter. Unlike Fury and Assassination, Survival actually has decent damage, however the biggest negative has and always will be that they have access to two range specs in Marksmanship and Beast Mastery, which currently can put out similar or better damage. With current raid design, being a ranged DPS will always be more valuable than being in melee, which puts Survival in a disadvantageous position, which combined with their frailty leaves them in the C tier. Moving on to the B tier, we have your more average specs, which each have their own strengths and weaknesses and will excel in different situations, but in general are all fine choices. Starting us off, we have Frost and Arcane Mages, who are currently a little lacking when it comes to damage, especially when compared to their fire counterparts, but they have just enough to keep them out of the C tier. Being a ranged DPS with solid mobility and immunity, and of course Arcane Intellect are all great bonuses as well, and while you're likely better off taking a Fire Mage in the vast majority of fights, for doing heroic content, both Frost and Arcane are more than passable. Next up we have our second Hunter spec in Beast Mastery, which puts out similar damage to Survival while also being ranged and the most mobile spec in the game, which is extremely useful when needing to do mechanics and DPS at the same time. While they don't have too much on the utility front, they do have access to an immunity in Turtle, which is extremely useful in multiple fights in Castle Nathria. From there we have Havoc Demon Hunters, which is yet another spec that recently saw a flat 5% buff. Despite being a bit below average when it comes to damage output, Demon Hunters bring some solid utility with an immunity in Netherwalk, a raid cooldown in Darkness, and of course Chaos Brand for a magic damage taken increase, though this last one can also be brought by Vengeance from the tank spot. While they are in melee, they have fantastic mobility and don't have another DPS spec to bring their unique utility, increasing their value a little bit. Then we have a couple Warlock specs with Demo and Destro, who are both doing a little bit better than the two previously mentioned Mage specs when it comes to damage and durability, though they remain a bit behind on the mobility front. As always, Locks have important utility with their Gates, Hellstones, and the always essential Summoning Stones, making one a must-have for any raid group. Just like with Hunters and Mages, however, they do have access to a superior spec in Affliction, which is looking very strong at the moment, decreasing Demo and Destro's value slightly. Next we have Frost DKs, who provide slightly below average damage, but make up for it with some great utility. The return of Anti-Magic Zone gives DKs an important raid cooldown, and their personal Anti-Magic Shell also has plenty of uses this raid tier. Like many other B tier specs though, they are losing out to a superior sister spec, in this case Unholy, but again they are still a perfectly viable choice if you are on a top end raider. We then have Arms Warriors, who bring the exact same utility as Fury with Rallying and Battle Shout, but bring better damage. While their overall damage remains below average, they excel at putting in damage when it counts, as they have amazing execute damage which is enhanced by the Venthyr Covenant ability Condemn, giving them access to a stronger execute more often. They also are fantastic at 2-target cleave, which is quite common in Castle Nathria, giving their value a bit of a boost this tier. Moving on, we have Ret Paladins, who bring extremely strong single target damage as well as decent execute damage, though they can be a little lacking in multi-target scenarios. A big plus is their spectacular utility with a couple immunities, freedom, and their new raid buff in Devotion Aura. Unfortunately for them, all of this utility can be brought by any paladin spec, and while they are the only DPS spec, both Prot and Holy are in decent spots, which could diminish the value of Ret's utility if they are also in the raid. They also are lacking a bit on the mobility front, which can definitely hurt them on certain fights. Joining Ret in the B tier, we have both Shaman specs, who are in a decent spot damage-wise, but are a bit lacking on the utility front. They have access to both Tremor and Windrush totems, which have some uses, but can also be brought by Resto Shamans who are very strong at the moment. For enhancement, they can also bring Wind Fury totem, which can be a decent DPS boost for certain melee specs, but this makes it dependent on your group composition to gain value, and of course adds to your melee stack. On the other hand, Ellie brings similar damage from the ranged position, making it a little more desirable. A downside for Shaman is their general lack of tankiness, but overall both Shaman specs are viable options for Castle Nathria. From there, we have our first Druid spec, with Ferals making an appearance. They are in a really good spot damage-wise, well above average, though they are another spec that is lacking on the utility front, only having access to Stampeding Roar. On top of this, as good as their damage is right now, Boom can still pull ahead, while having the added advantages of being ranged and bringing more utility, which definitely hurts Feral's value a bit. To conclude the B tier, we have our other two rogue specs in Outlaw and Subtlety, who as previously mentioned just bring more damage than their assassination counterparts. Rogues are extremely durable compared to other melee specs as well, and bringing Cloak of Shadows can be very useful in a few fights, helping to distinguish rogues among the heavy competition for melee raid spots. With the B tier done, we move on to the A tier, housing some of the above average specs that provide strong damage as well as solid utility, making them great additions for the majority of fights in Castle Nathria. To kick things off, we have our third mage spec in Fire, who are currently in a better spot damage-wise than the other two mage specs, while bringing the same utility. This is largely due to Shifting Power, the Mage Night Fae ability, allowing Fire to reduce many of their short cooldown abilities, including Combustion, which can get down to around a 1 minute cooldown. They also have the Cheat Death and Cauterize, making them a bit more durable than the other mage specs. Alongside Fire in the A tier, we have Windwalker Monks, who are looking great through the start of the expansion. They have solid mobility and are one of the tankiest melee specs in the game, and their damage is very good at the moment. When it comes to utility, they have the important physical damage debuff in Mystic Touch, as well as the snare removal in Tiger's Lust. However, as is the case with other specs like Havoc and Ret, all of this utility can be brought by any monk, so Windwalker's utility can lose value if your raid has a Brewmaster or a Mistweaver. Next, we've got our third Warlock spec in Affliction, which falls into a similar situation as Fire Mage, where they just bring the most damage out of the three Warlock specs, and since all Warlocks bring the same utility, they'll be the de facto choice for most, if not all, of Castle Nathria. Night Fae being the best choice for Affliction also helps, as their general ability Soul Shape gives Locks a much needed mobility boost. Rounding out the A tier, we have the reworked Shadow Priests, who bring similar multi-dotting capabilities as Affliction, along with strong execute damage and a different set of utility. Stamina buff is always important, and even Leap of Faith has some niche uses this tier, though again all of this utility can be brought by other priests, with Disc being an especially strong option. Shadow does bring some unique tools however, with Dispersion being an extremely large DR allowing them to do otherwise lethal mechanics, and Vampiric Embrace being an alright raid cooldown providing a decent amount of healing. From there, we have our top 3 specs in the S tier, which are all among the highest damage specs in the game, in addition to the utility they each bring, making them a top choice in pretty much all situations in Castle Nathria. To start off, we have Unholy Death Knights, who are currently doing insane damage, significantly beating out their Frost counterparts. As is the case with many classes, they also bring the exact same utility, with an extremely valuable raid cooldown and anti-magic zone, as well as a powerful personal and anti-magic shell, which can be used to help deal with many magic effects in Castle Nathria. They also bring the improved Soul Reaper, allowing them to pump out strong execute damage, which is always important in cutting-edge content. Moving on, Boomkins are also in the S tier for Castle Nathria, again largely due to their exceptional damage. They do bring some strong utility on top of this damage however, with the addition of Stampeding Roar as a movement cooldown, Innervate to help with healer mana, Heart of the Wild allowing them to off-heal for high damage moments, and Solar Beam which sees some niche use. While they don't have strong execute damage like the other S tier specs, they bring great consistent damage from range that goes along with their high mobility and durability, making them a solid overall choice in Castle Nathria. To finish off our raid rankings, we have Marksmanship Hunters. As with a lot of the other top tier specs, they have the highest damage out of their sister specs while bringing the exact same utility, putting them in a solid spot. A lot of MM's strength comes from their exceptional burst damage, which is on a fairly short cooldown, allowing them to hold it to burst down priority targets when needed or just dump into the boss otherwise. Like other hunter specs, Turtle is a great tool for dealing with many raid mechanics, and with the return of Killshot, MM has some solid execute damage as well, which as we've discussed is always valuable during progression raiding. With the raid rankings done, let's now take a look at how DPS specs are performing in Mythic Plus. As a reminder, this list is focusing on how specs are doing for higher keys, as all specs are more than capable of getting their Keystone Master achievement. Starting us off in the C tier, we have all 3 C tier specs from raids, with Survival, Assassination, and Fury. All 3 of these specs are here for similar reasons, with Assassination and Fury struggling when it comes to damage output, Survival having to choose between putting out AoE damage or single target damage, and all 3 having stronger options and being in melee, which is significantly more punishing in Shadowlands Mythic Plus than it was in BFA. So far in Shadowlands, dungeon and affix design has definitely been favoring ranged DPS, so it's looking like there's going to be a pretty hard shift in the meta away from melee classes and towards double or even triple ranged groups. Joining these specs in the C tier, we have Demonology Warlocks, with their biggest problem being their ramp time, as it takes them a little while to start putting out good damage, and they're also a bit lacking on the mobility front, especially compared to the other top tier specs. While Healthstones are still quite valuable in dungeons, Lock Gates are niche at best, hurting the value of Lock's utility in Mythic Plus, leaving Demonology down in the C tier. From there, we jump to our middling specs in the B tier, beginning again with Arcane and Frost, for similar reasons as in raids. Their dungeon utility is definitely better than their raid utility, as having things like Arcane Intellect and Bloodlust become much more important in 5-man content, and of course the immunity and Ice Block is always good. However, they once again suffer from the problem many triple DPS spec classes do, as they just aren't as good as Fire when it comes to pumping out damage. For similar reasons, both Frost DKs and BM Hunters find themselves in the B tier as well, losing out to Unholy and MM respectively, but each for different reasons. For DKs, Frost is the more bursty, cooldown reliant spec, compared to Unholy, which is able to put out huge AoE damage pretty much on demand. AMZ is a little less useful in dungeons as well, but still has its uses, especially for the seasonal affects and Prideful. Frost does have access to a battle res, which every push group will need, as well as a death grip for those pesky caster ads, but once again these are available to Unholy as well. For BM, they have the opposite problem, where they're the more consistent damage spec and able to DPS on the move, but they're just beaten out by the extremely high burst of MM, only having the utility from Spirit Mend as an advantage. We then have Havoc Demon Hunters, who've lost some of their durability in Shadowlands, but are still extremely mobile, have decent burst damage, and bring the important magic damage increase in Chaos Brand. Unfortunately, with how strong Vengeance is currently looking in Mythic Plus, this hurts the value of Havoc since these debuffs do not stack. On top of this, its value is dependent on your group composition, as if you don't have magic damage specs in your group to take advantage of it, it becomes less worthwhile. Next up, we have Arms Warriors, who can pump out great priority target damage alongside powerful execute damage, which is great for tyrannical weeks. They have a couple solid defensive cooldowns in Die by the Sword and Spell Reflect, as well as some decent utility with Rallying and Battle Shout, but they are really lacking when it comes to self-sustain, especially in Shadowlands when being in melee is much more dangerous than previous expansions. Moving on, we have Ret Paladins, whose strong raid utility transfers well into dungeons, with immunities, snare removals, and of course Diva Aura all having value in both forms of content. Similar to Arms, they pump out strong single target damage and have solid execute, however they have some of the self-sustain Arms is lacking, though at the expense of being a bit more cooldown reliant to pump out damage. Then we've got Feral Druids, who are again suffering from being a melee DPS in an expansion currently favoring ranged specs in dungeons. They definitely have a worse community perception than they deserve, as they have solid damage, albeit while being a tad squishier than most melee options. Druid dungeon utility is fantastic, however, with Cyclone now baseline, as well as having access to things like a Battle Res, Mass Root, Ursul's Vortex, and Typhoon. However, all 3 other Druid specs are in a good spot as well, and provide the same, if not more, utility. Feral is by no means bad, but for the top keys, I doubt groups will pick one to be their Druid. From there, we have our 2 other Warlock specs with Destro and Affliction, where they are in a very similar spot in terms of damage output, with Destro being the burstier of the 2, relying on their Infernal cooldown for AoE, and Affliction having steadier sustained damage output. They of course share utility with Demonology, with Hellstones and their AoE stun and Shadow Fury being quite valuable in dungeon content. I will note that Affliction can struggle on lower keys or tyrannical weeks when the trash mobs don't live long enough to get their dots out, but for higher keys this isn't likely to be an issue. Joining Warlocks in the B tier, we have Windwalker Monks, who are a very sturdy DPS spec with strong cleave and mobility, which is very useful when playing in the danger zone that is melee in Shadowlands. They also bring Mystic Touch, which just like Chaos Brand is dependent on your group to gain value, but can be quite strong with the correct composition. On top of this, their dungeon utility is much better than in raids, with spells like Tiger's Lust, Ring of Peace, and an AoE stun and leg sweep all being quite useful. Overall, Windwalkers are in a much better spot than they've been in the past. Unfortunately, it comes at a time when many groups are passing on melee DPS in favor of more ranged. To complete the B tier, we have Enhancement Shamans, yet another melee spec that has good damage, in their case sustained as opposed to burst, but is just struggling to get over the fact that it's stuck in melee and not ranged. While they are on the squishy side, Shamans do have great dungeon utility in general, with Bloodlust, an AoE stun, Earth Elemental, and the shortest cooldown kick in the game. Enhancement themselves also brings Wind Fury Totem, though this is unlikely to have much value in dungeons, as again, most groups are moving away from melee specs, not towards them, causing this totem to be less valuable than it could be. With the B tier done, we move on to our above average specs in the A tier, starting with Shaman's other DPS spec, Elemental. Aside from the clear advantage of being a ranged spec with the exact same utilities, one of the biggest strengths of Elemental over Enhancement is Earthquake, especially on larger pulls, as this uncapped AoE ability has the chance to knock down enemies, preventing tank damage and in some cases even adding extra interrupts. This is an invaluable addition to a group, especially one full of ranged DPS with longer cooldown kicks, and when combined with Elemental's other great utility and solid overall damage, leaves them being quite desirable in Mythic Plus. Next, we've got Shadow Priests, who are looking much better in 5-man content after their rework in Shadowlands, largely thanks to their reduced ramp-up time and powerful talent choices. The re-addition of Mindsoothe and Power Infusion are also really nice, with the former being quite useful for certain small skips across several different dungeons, and the latter providing a nice little DPS boost. Fortitude and Vampiric Embrace are also great to have, especially with the heavy consistent damage coming out from Prideful, and the change allowing Master Spell to remove bursting makes having at least one priest in your group a lot more valuable for those weeks. Finishing off the A tier, we have both of our remaining rogue specs in Outlaw and Subtlety. As I'm sure many of you are aware, Shroud is a fantastic ability in dungeons, especially for Prideful where the mini-boss spawns every 20 trash %, so having the ability to skip certain mobs to spawn the Prideful at exactly where you want to is invaluable. Rogues also have the benefit of being quite durable in melee, with additional utility in tricks, Cloak of Shadows, an Enraged Dispel, Sap, and a plethora of stuns. Currently, I think Outlaw is beating out Subtlety by a bit, but overall both specs are still quite strong and great additions to any Mythic Plus group. That leaves us with our 4 S tier specs, starting off with Boomkins. Having an uncapped AoE at range is extremely powerful, especially when you aren't missing out when it comes to single target damage. Boomkins also come with the Swiss Army Knife Druid kit with the general abilities like Stampeding Roar, Mass Root, Typhoon, Ursula's Vortex, and Battle Res, in addition to some Boomkin specific things like Trance and Solar Beam, which are both extremely strong in 5-man content. Their one drawback is sharing a lot of their utility with Resto Druids, who are also a powerful dungeon spec. However, even with overlapping utility, their strong damage alone makes them a very good pick for pushing keys. Then we have our only melee spec in the S tier with Unholy DKs, which is another case of a spec having pretty good utility but just having insane uncapped AoE damage. If you're able to pull enough, Unholy is able to do absolutely ridiculous damage, and their utility spells in AMZ, Death Grip, and Battle Res are all just a bonus. Like Boomkins, their uncapped AoE is combined with strong single target, making them good in pretty much all scenarios. For them, the obvious weakness is being in melee, which could result in them getting dropped on certain affixes such as Storming, but overall they are one of the best options when it comes to pumping out big damage. Joining Unholy and Boomkin in the S tier, we have Fire Mages, yet another uncapped AoE spec, with abilities like Flame Strike and Flame Patch. Their biggest strength, however, comes from their ability to significantly reduce Combustion's cooldown all the way down to below 1 minute at times, thanks to both the Night Fae ability and the Kindling talent. This allows them to have much more consistent burst damage in dungeons, and makes them exceptionally strong if tanks are pulling around their cooldowns. That doesn't even mention the mage utility they bring, with an immunity, a cheat death, solid mobility, and bloodlust all coming from a ranged DPS spec. And that means last up in the S tier we yet again have Marksmanship Hunters. They provide insane burst damage on short cooldowns with things like Volley, Explosive Shot, and the Night Fae ability Wild Spirits, and of course having the consistency of trick shots outside of these windows. Their single target is nothing to scoff at either, and their utility is decent with many traps, Binding Shot, Bloodlust, Misdirect, and a Purge at their disposal. Their one weakness compared to the other S tier specs is probably the lack of uncapped AoE outside of their burst window, but this really doesn't affect them too much as the vast majority of the pulls will fit under their 6 target cap. But that is it for my Shadowlands Season 1 DPS rankings for Mythic Castle Nathria and High Mythic Plus. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like and subscribe, it really does help. If you're looking for guides to all the new content Shadowlands has to offer, I have quick Mythic dungeon walkthroughs and normal and heroic boss guides on my channel, so feel free to check them out. If you want to keep up to date with me, you can follow me on Twitter or check me out on Twitch, both at Tactics. As always, thanks everyone so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.